All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Going to do another episode with Shane Kennedy, of course, who is on this channel for many of our chats, the postmodern theology ones with Tim and Max Horn most recently. And we're going to go into some of his orthodox views that you were telling me about on subjects such as freedom and God, and we're going to kind of deconstruct them and get into them. And I'm going to ask a lot of questions and not going to have any heated debate or anything like that, but I'll challenge you about some things and we can get into the details of your perspectives on them. So, yeah, how do you want to start this off? Because I know it was your idea to talk about this. I know you just made a few suggestions, but do you have a way that you prefer talking about this?
Well, I mean, I think my way of talking about it would just kind of make sense if I just kind of say what my goals are, so to speak. So I've been trying to come to understand, Orthodox theology a lot more over the last year, I would say. And people have so many different definitions of God, definitions of Christianity. People interpret the Bible in so many different ways. So I'm trying to understand what it is that this Eastern Church believes that I'm a part of. I guess no, I guess I am. So, and it's interesting to explore because I find their conception of freedom and free will much more, I think, in line with modern sensibilities. Funnily enough, than some of what Western Christians believe, and even more so perhaps than and definitely it's definitely not. I'm definitely not discovering a God or a religion or a Christianity that bears much resemblance to what I think like a Sam Harris would talk about, or even slightly more sophisticated actors than him. So I
Yeah,
don't quite understand it myself yet, but I did find some interesting uh, quotes on God and the relationship between oneself, God, and freedom. And I just thought they were interesting. I don't completely understand them, but I sent them over to Andrew, and he's kind enough to kind of help me kind of figure out what they mean, and he's nice enough to ask me some questions. So I just figured whatever kind of catches your eye, Andrew, in those quotes, or and we can just kind of riff from there. I don't think it'll be very hard to make conversation off it. So
okay. Yeah, the we've talked before about how well I still don't really share any of your beliefs. I think that your theological perspectives in general are much more interesting than the typical Western views, as you were talking about, that particularly militant atheists use to criticize religion. So that's it's interesting to learn more about that. Yeah.
well, there
Uh,
we are.
so do you want to go through those quotes from that book that you sent me?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you're able to just pull it up there on your phone, I sent some screenshots. I mean, I could do it on mine too, but it might be better if you're able to. Just uh, just open one and maybe just pick one and start reading. And
Sure.
when something catches your eyes that leads to a question, yeah, just go with that.
Okay. So, by becoming incarnate, Christ has made it possible for us not to imitate but to relive his life, capital H, his, to conform ourselves to its essence, which is precisely what the sacraments and the liturgical cycle teach us. So I get that, trying to imitate Christ. I get that. And the liturgical cycle. I know what those terms sacraments and liturgical cycle mean in general, but what do you think specifically sacraments and liturgical mean in this context?
Well, well, so the sacraments are basically are things things that bring you closer to Christ. Is I think the simplest way to say them. So, because as I've come to understand it, basically there's this line from the Bible that it goes something like, "So that I no longer live, but Christ lives in me," and that's why the sacrament of the Eucharist is so important. That it's really His body coming inside you, because the basic idea and
Coming
some of the
inside
freedom
you.
quote. Yeah, well, there you go. Yeah. So basically, yeah, and then when you get so that's what the sacrament does, and the liturgical life, liturgy means common work. So really, what I think the Christianity is about is Christ has created this vehicle for everybody to literally be his body and to join together and act out his pattern. But they actually do that by him literally being inside you, and you kind of become like a well, like his body, you become a conduit for the head that is Jesus. So
So
it's a very intensely on this last point. It's a very as I'm coming to understand it, it's a very intensely communal thing to do. That's why so liturgy means common work. So it's so as I've and I'm not disparaging any other interpretations of Christianity when I say this, but there's some people nowadays who practice Christianity kind of alone, and as I've come to understand it, it's like almost oxymoronic as far as I'm seeing it, because a liturgical lifestyle means that unity in Christ that you're supposed to achieve in love, you're all supposed to come together. So that's what the sacraments are aimed to do, is that create that unity, and the liturgical lifestyle is you acting that out as the body of Christ. Does that make
okay.
sense?
So what do like why is it a problem for people to be Christian, quote unquote, alone? It's that they're not as connected to Christ. And when you use the word literally there, like literally part of Christ, I'm assuming you don't mean literal in the sense that you literally take Jesus's dead body and like put it inside you or something. Do you mean like a literal, like some sort of spiritual connection to the spirit of Jesus and embodied inside you in some sort of spiritual way?
Um, it's close to that. I think it means literal in a non-materialistic understanding of the world. So another word for sacrament, like the Greek word is mysterion, and we that common root word of mystery. So the exact mechanisms by which it happens are kind of unknown. You know, in the Catholic Church, they try to define it or how it occurs, but it's kind of left as a mystery. So what literal means is through some way that we don't understand, we actually, in quotes, become his body. And I'm not quite sure exactly what that means, but I know it's something non-material, and it's something that is it's an ontological change. So that's something
Okay.
I keep going over. It's not like an ethical or symbolic or metaphorical thing, which is what philosophy might reduce it to, or a deist interpretation, like the American founding fathers might reduce it to. Like it's just a story. But in the Orthodox belief, it's a real ontological change. So your very nature has changed to incorporate capital N, capital C, new creation. So
So
that's where the whole premise of eternal life comes from, because you're actually ontologically changing. That explains how you could open up possibilities that were not available to you beforehand.
so so you're comfortable, and people in general are comfortable in this Orthodox view of of not knowing how exactly this sort of change happens, and the like, even if, as you said, you don't under like, it's a mystery how it happens, and it's some sort of spiritual transformation, but you're comfortable with not having answers for that. And is it also um, is the idea to always keep seeking out the answers, or are you just comfortable, just content with it being a mystery? Or is the idea to eventually want to figure it out, or is it the idea to for it to just permanently remain a mystery?
Um, I think different Christians would approach this differently. So I think a lot of what they've tried to do with like Aquinas and Kant, for instance, is they really try to drill down like the mechanics, you know, of how these things would occur, and proofs and propositions. You know, William Lane Craig's kind of in that school of thought. So I mean, that's one way to approach understanding God. But the other way is more kind of in line with like an aesthetic, I'm going to use the word Buddhist just because it's something familiar to people nowadays, because the monk traditions kind of died off in Christianity, at least in the West. So people aren't as familiar with that. But the idea is that past a certain point, explicit language or like explaining these mechanisms, it kind of breaks down. And the only way you can come to know it is, or see it in a more full way, is through the subjective experiences of prayer and a holy lifestyle, and then these things will be revealed to you directly. So at that point, it becomes very much something that you're only going to see if you go through with it. So that's kind of the journey I'm on right now, which is uh, intellectually, I can only understand Christianity so far. So I'm going to have to spend the next 10 years, rest of my life, kind of seeing what's there. Maybe I can report back in a more tangible way, but it's something to be lived. So that's why Orthodox theology is very experiential. It's designed to be lived in liturgy, in the sacrament, in the body of Christ. It's not an intellectual exercise per se. That
Okay.
makes sense.
So to a certain extent, the answers are ineffable rather, but the goal is to try to understand those questions through prayer and other practices. And also, obviously we're talking about Christianity, and I think you might have clarified this the other day, but the idea is your opinion, or the Orthodox opinion that you share, perhaps, that not necessarily that doing this through the perspective of Christianity and Jesus is the only way to achieve that, but that it's the best way to achieve that,
Yes, yes.
like
So I
rather
mean,
than
like,
other religions.
yeah, I mean, I always had, like, so to speak from my own personal point of view, I always had an intuition that, if you believe God picked the chosen people and created a covenant with them, and I have a variety of reasons why I think God would choose to interact with humanity that way, but um, it never really made sense that it's the only interaction with humanity that God has, or that those are the only people kind of I don't know, accessing the good, capital G, let's say, right? And so as it turns out, yeah, early church fathers recognized that there were other ways, and there were certainly some pagans who had done that. And what they kind of not fall back on, but the kind of perspective is like, we've been given this message, so we know this is what we've been instructed to do. We don't know the situation of outsiders. We don't know what they've been told or not told. And then obviously Christianity, you're not supposed to be terribly judgmental about other people to begin with. So it's kind of in a situation where,
Depends on your
look, I
version
don't
of
know.
Christianity.
Yeah, well, it depends on which version and which time and which version, right? Because
Yeah.
it's but I think the basic idea is like, well, look, like, we have this gospel, we have this good news, we think this is the shit, so we obviously want everybody to buy in on it, but we don't really know what you got going on. We don't suspect it's good, but like at the end of the day, we can't really speak to that, because yeah, can't really speak to that too concretely, except to say that, like, the literal square quotes manifestation of God told us this is the pattern to follow. So that's a pretty good. I mean, it's pretty declarative from that point of view, right? So
So
to me, by that premise.
what do you mean by the literal manifestation of God told you that this is the practice to follow? Like, what do you mean by the literal manifestation of God, and the literal manifestation of God told who to, and do you mean that the literal
Well, the logos.
manifestation of God told someone to do this practice of prayer and other liturgical practices to try to achieve this unity with Jesus?
Okay, so there's a couple questions there. So I'll just so the one is like, who told this message, and the second one is, who said that this was the method to reach it. So basically, in terms of like the Christian Genesis story, basically throughout all the Old Testament, whenever you see God directly interacting with reality, that's not God the Father of the Trinity. That's the Logos. That's the Word. That's the thing that's the part of God that made the universe, right? And it's that part, that Logos, that comes down and is Christ. So
And
Uh,
why? And could you elaborate a little bit more on the difference between that and the God of the Trinity, as you said?
well, that is the God of the Trinity. So in the
The God
God of
of
the
the Trinity
Trinity,
is the Logos?
well, in Trinity, basically you have Father, that's the originator, that's the creator of all things, that's the source of everything. Then you have the Logos.
The
With
Trinity is the creator of all things?
No, within the Trinity, there's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Oh, okay. So
So
the Father aspect of the Holy Trinity is the creator of all things.
yeah, that's like Yahweh, basically. I
Okay.
mean, I'm gonna make some mistakes, and somebody more educated than I would probably have clarifications, but it's roughly correct to think of the Father as like the progenitor, the source of everything. The Logos is the actual creative capacity acting in the world that came down and is Christ, and the Holy Spirit is basically the energies of God interacting with the world. So God Himself doesn't like in his physical, well, physical is the wrong way to say it, but God in his essence is the term they use. His essence doesn't actually come down to the planet, but his energies do in the Orthodox belief come down, and that's the Holy Spirit. So that's
So
the
the
that's what
Holy
happens at
Spirit is the energy
Pentecost.
of God?
I'm pretty sure that's basically correct. Yes,
Okay. And
that's how that works.
could you clarify a little bit more by what you mean by the Logos?
Um, the Logos is basically the creative capacity. So when you think of like the image of God, like every human being has the image of God. It's it's the fact that only human beings with because they have the image actually can create. That's the special power that only God and humans in His image have. So angels can't create, the devil can't create, only humans and God can create, and that's
Okay.
and that's and that's the image of God, and the logos is the purest form of that. Might be one way to
And
think of it.
no other species too, right? So no other animals or anything can create?
Um, Basically, that I don't think it explicitly says that's the case. But I think you wouldn't find many Christians of any status or like father level or highly prized theologians who would say otherwise. So
Okay.
I'm still agnostic exactly on that question, but I don't suspect it's the case. So
Well, I think that like species similar to humans, for example, like monkeys can create, like do
well,
primitive art, and like chimpanzees, for example, have made spears and can make basic tools, for example. Depends on what you
okay. Well,
define by creativity, but those are
yeah.
making things.
Well, what are your beliefs on free will? Like, are you a free will determinist? Do you think people actually have free will? How do you come down on that question?
I'm pretty, I would say I'm kind of agnostic about free will. Well, I don't know, because I don't I really don't like the determinist approach, but I also really don't like the consequentialist approach. Which for those of you watching who don't know, I might butcher this a little bit, but if I understand it correctly, it's the idea that things are still determined, but you still have the ability to make choices. I think it's something like that. Is that what you've heard about what consequentialism is?
To be honest, like I haven't really memorized the terms because I just I don't really see the point to it.
Okay.
I'm such a firm believer in free will that it's like I don't know. It's just what is it?
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
I've never, and doesn't really seem like there's much to argue about, right? Because ultimately, like when you have like the Sam Harris or the Daniel Dennett free will, it's pretty straightforward what they're contending. It's like it's
okay.
all just causality from
Well,
chemicals to neurons to the biology. So that they think that's the case. They think it's where science is leading. I don't think it's science is leading. I don't really know what more there is to say about it.
okay.
So
Well, I think you laid out there some of the main problems with the diehard determinist approach. Um, and like realistically, for the main thing for me with that is there's not really any objective confirmable evidence that shows that events are predetermined. Like, you can make this cause and effect argument very strongly for about a lot of events that have taken place throughout the universe, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're predetermined. And like I don't like consequentialism as much because it doesn't it seems too convenient to me for I think like the idea that yeah you have free will but things are also determined, like that just seems like a cop out almost to me. But then also like to go with the to address your perspective, I think that the perspective like being a diehard fan and advocate of free will, that doesn't make sense to me either, because while I don't while I don't totally disagree with the, or I mean, I definitely don't agree with the determinist approach. I do actually, while I disagree with Sam Harris about a lot, I think his argument about how free will doesn't really exist kind of makes a lot of sense. But if I were to just give my intuitive feeling about it, I would say that I'm not saying this is a scientific truth claim, but I would say that my feeling is just that it seems like we have the ability to make decisions, and evolution led to that result. You could say that we believe we are making decisions, so that's partially why I also say to make a long story short, I guess, is that I kind of agree with what you said earlier, that whether free will exists or not doesn't really matter, because whether we are making choices or whether we just think we're making choices, the effect is really the same regardless of whether free will exists or not.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we kind of agree on that. So the reason I brought up the free will question is, like, to whatever extent it's like, let's say mechanistic. That's basically what Sam Harris is arguing, that it's all just a cascading series of causalities, and there's no at no point is there any creativity or generative thing. It's all
Mhm.
just some cascading. So perhaps, like, so that's what I think. I kind of relate that idea roughly to the idea of being in the image of God. So whatever manifesting that free will thing is, to me, that's acting out the image of God. Is actually somewhere in that causal chain, something that is your will inserts itself.
You know
And
that
and I
that kind of sounds kind of mechanistic to me, but mechanistic in terms of religion rather than science.
well, I mean, uh, it's like, well, like, again, coming back to the definition of logos, it is that it's channeling that order, that chaos into order. That's what God does when He makes the world. He takes things that are formless and forms them. So that action of forming things,
Why does
that's
he,
that's what
why does he do that?
because He decided it was good. That's
Why
all
did he
we know.
decide it was good?
He just decided it was good. I mean, like,
Oh.
it's funny. The Orthodox will say things like, it's like God didn't need us. He didn't have to do any of this. But he just wanted to, and so he
That
did, and
doesn't
here we
seem
are.
like much of a reason to me. I don't think Orthodox like this is going to sound arrogant, but it doesn't sound to me like there's a very good Orthodox answer to why God decided to create the universe and humans.
Well, I mean that. Okay, I mean, well, it's funny. It's funny because this is exactly where the pushing my understanding thing comes in. Because even as said that, I hear you say that, there's this interesting idea that you can't understand the beginning until you know the end. And it's kind of like Aristotle's
That is an
final clause.
interesting idea. Sorry,
Like Aristotle's
Aristotle's what?
yeah, final clause,
No.
like the reason something was made. Like in Aristotle, there's four causes. There's the material cause, which is, so pick anything. Usually use a boat, right? So the material cause is the material you physically make the boat of. Without those materials, you would have no boat. So whatever causation the boat causes needs the materials. The next cause is the efficient cause. That's what science primarily studies, and that's the actual mechanics, descriptive mechanics of why the boat, that when the material aligns this way with the wind pressure and the forces and all that jazz, why it goes somewhere. Then there's the formal clause, which is the actual structure the boat takes. So you need like a plan or a schematic to actually build the thing. So your DNA kind of maps the formal cause of a body. Then there's the final cause, which is I'm building this boat to move grain from Egypt to Constantinople to feed the people. And so that final cause, so when you make the boat, it's like, well, why make the boat? And while the guy's building it, he might not know why he made that boat. But it could be the case that that boat's going to fill, ends up feeding 10,000 people. And in the end, then you can see why it was built in the first place, so to speak, right? So it's similar, I think, with God's plan, because eventually his kingdom is supposed to come to earth. Heaven is supposed to come down to earth. Like one big difference between orthodoxy and standard Western Christianity is that heaven's not a place you go to; it's a place that actually comes to earth, and they become united. And so there's this
So where does it come from?
where does it come from? Well, technically,
Like, do you mean that
so
it comes into existence when it's going to unify with Earth, or it exists before then and it comes from someplace else?
it's
Because you
already
said that
it's
sorry.
already started. No, I
Okay.
didn't mean to cut you off. It's already started. So once Christ was resurrected, heaven has already started to come. It's just in the process of completing, which will be
It's,
ultimately occurring in Revelation.
it's like being
So,
constructed.
well, like in theory, every time you commune with God, heaven touches earth. That's a connection. So it's happening all the time.
What does that mean?
Well, so in the Catholics have a term called the beatific vision. Have you ever heard of that? Sound roughly familiar? The
No.
beatific vision. Okay, so basically, in like the Catholic conception, as I understand it, once you that beatific vision is actually seeing God and experiencing God or experiencing heaven, and that happens after you die, right? You die, then you have access to that. Whereas in the Orthodox understanding, through asceticism, prayer, purification, so then you can actually see things properly. Jesus is very big on like you're looking but you're not seeing, like you know but you don't understand, kind of things. So when you purify or illuminate yourself, you actually can commune with God while on this planet, and that's when the kingdom of heaven is actually touching the earth. They actually they actually overlap in some way, and that's something that happens all the time.
Okay, so in the beatific vision, when you die, you achieve that communing with God.
In heaven. Yeah.
In heaven. Why is that, and why do you think they think about it differently than the Orthodox view? And then also, what is meant by purifying yourself? Like, how do you purify yourself to commune with God, to achieve the heaven on earth, as it sounds?
Well, just I think again, I hate to use Buddhism as a shorthand. It's just kind of simpler. But when you think of everything that like a Buddhist monk would go through to get to nirvana, Christian, and I can get in more detail if you like, but Christians have a process that they started developing from like right after Christ died, to do basically the same thing, but instead of reaching nirvana, you reach theosis, which is deification. God comes and dwells in you, and you commune directly with God, and that's heaven touching earth.
Does that
That's
mean that you turn into a god or a demigod too?
it's funny. Like there's this classic Orthodox phrase, which is, God became man so man could become God. So God can, because like so God can actually dwell in you. So the Jews had like the holy of the holy, that special room that only the one priest could go in. That was the temple on the Temple Mount, and that's where God came to rest. That's where they kept the covenant. And what Jesus basically said is, no, now you are the temple. I will come to rest in you. So every Christian has the capacity through the Holy Spirit to actually have God come into them.
Why
And then
why
God,
did Jesus say that, and why was you said the ark of the covenant? Did you just mention that? The Why was it
yes, that was,
there?
well, because like so when God originally set up his deal with the chosen people, he first gave them laws. And basically, like one way I've heard it described is it's kind of like a child, right? When you deal with children, you can't explain to them a full, like a principles based system when they're 4 years old. So you start off with rules, right? But at a certain point, rules aren't gonna be enough. There's too many exceptions. Things are too complicated. It's very easy to hide behind rules and twist them. Especially if you get into philosophy or wordplay, you can twist And as we see in a lot of examples, you can twist words to quote unquote reasonably mean almost whatever you want, right? And somebody can get up there and tell you, no, you're misinterpreting it. But if you're clever enough with your speech, you can do a lot of things. So Jesus basically comes around and basically calls everybody hypocrites and says, look, the law got you this far, but I've come to fulfill the law, and I'm going to give you something better than that. And that's these principles that you will have to purify yourself to get illuminated to understand. And when you do that, then I can actually come inside you, and in our unity, me with
I'm
you,
inside you. Sorry, I keep laughing at that.
I can indwell in the temple that is your body. And when I indwell in the temple that is your body,
Hey, baby, let me dwell in the temple that is your body.
well, that's funny because the relationship between you and God is very much a marriage.
Okay.
It's like a lot of like the exact same language between your relationship with God is the exact same language as marriage. It's all the kind of the same thing. Like the patterns in Orthodoxy just keep repeating themselves. So it is that kind of
The endless
and as
cycle. That's kind
yeah,
of
well,
that's kind of Buddhist too, in a way.
it's very
But
it's very similar.
I
Go on,
wanted
sorry.
to say, before I ask you what those principles are to purify yourself, but what you just said about Jesus there in terms of law is actually, it's actually kind of what I was saying yesterday, and I didn't realize that you had that view. That I was explaining about how Jesus speaks out against capital L law in the Bible, and you were just describing that section in the Bible. So that I appreciate that actually, because it's more it makes more sense to me. I just like that I like that perspective more. It's more interesting. But
I do
also,
too. I do too. Okay, go on. Yeah.
what are those principles that you spoke of?
Oh, it's really simple. It's love God with all your heart, all your body, and all your mind and your soul, and love thy neighbor as thyself. All the law can be summed up in that. That's it. That's all you
Okay.
gotta do.
So this is an easy question that I'm sure you've heard many times before, especially like in religious debates, but why should you love your neighbor as you love yourself?
Why should you love your neighbor as you love yourself? Okay. Why should you do that? Why should you do that? Hmm, Geez, that should be an easy question. Maybe I'm overthinking it. Because the thing is, I don't want to give a moral. I'm trying to avoid giving a moral or an ethical argument because you can give those, but that's not technically. I know that's not what you're supposed to do. Oh, okay. It's something like this. It's like what? Oh, that's what it is. Okay. So, um, in the way that God made the world, everybody has a nature. Okay. So this comes back to the freedom question and what does it mean to be free? So you were given this image bearing capacity of God, and you're free to do with it what you want. Um, the best if you choose to use it for the capital G good, if you if you choose to love God and let His love flow through you, then you that's how you get eternal life because that's how you become part of the new creation. Because the only way to actually transcend your biology and transcend the material world is through God. So that's what salvation is. That's the salvation that's offered in Christianity is to do that. So you don't.
Why is that the only way? And also that sounds like it's sort of counter to what you were saying earlier, which is that the Orthodox or even Christian in general way to achieve this is not the only way, but you just said that it's the
Sorry,
only way.
you're right. That's the only way I know of. Okay, maybe think of it this way, right? Like if by almost by definition, if you're a materialist and you only think you're a material thing, then by definition, if you're living out a biological life, all biological life ends. Okay, so the only story or vehicle to actually like so the Buddhists believe in or sorry the Hindus or that's not the correct term but the religions that are found in India, some of them believe in reincarnation, so they believe you have a soul that goes through this path, right? So I don't know those details enough to talk about it in depth, but in the Christian conception, what baptism and chrismation, those sacraments are, is a layer of life, one way to put it, beyond the biological. That's what you're born into. That's when you say born again, that's what that means. You're born again to, you now have a part of you that's not just biological, that can keep going. So that's something your nature gives you access to because you are made in the image of God, and that's the thing you can do. So why should you love your neighbor as yourself? Well, because that's the path, that's the pathway to commune with God, is through love. So one thing I really like that I find super groovy, that the Coptic priest that I go to talks to, he says, like, God isn't like, and some of the quotes talk about this. God isn't this intellectual idea. If you want to know God, you know God when you love someone selflessly, because that's God acting through you. That because God is love, is doing. That's how you come to know God. That's how you come to know Jesus, is by not imitating, but actually Him living in you through that action. So that's, yeah. So that would be the reason to do it, because that actually allows you to commune with God, and that's how you end up getting, through His grace, your eternal life.
So you should love, to oversimplify it, you should love your neighbor because it allows you to love God.
It allows God. No, it allows you to love God.
Because that
Yeah,
seems
it
like
allows you.
that seems like two laws which are really almost kind of one law.
Yes, it is. It really is. Yeah, it's really, it's actually, it's really easy to dress it up, make it super complicated, but it's essentially just God is love. He wants His love to flow through you, and if you do that, that's like the only thing you're supposed to do, is just go around loving everything and living in the moment. That's pretty much what it calls you to do.
Why?
And everything else is, pardon,
Why?
because that's what God made you to do.
So because God said so.
Um, Well, I mean, it's your choice, right? It's like, if you live a biological life, then you will meet a biological end. I mean, you can choose to go off and play whatever game you want, but those will lead where those will lead. The things that will come to you if you live, if you live God's plan, are a different set of things will happen to you. And there's like a certain amount of joy and peace in particular that come to you when you live that way. And I've seen it firsthand with people who I find to be holy. Like, you can just see the peace and the love, like, just oozing out of them. It's the most, it's really changed my outlook on things, because it's like the proof's right there. If
Mhm.
proof was needed, like, you can just see it. And
So
and then
because,
two,
sorry.
yeah, no, go on.
Um,
Whatever. So,
so because it can, we've talked about this a bit before. So because it can help you from a pragmatic perspective, it's good to do this because it can help you. But I think we've also talked before about how, like, you can achieve this in other ways too, presumably, right? Like, I think you've also agreed to that before. So it doesn't necessarily, to me, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong in saying that you've agreed to this before, but if that's the case, then to me it could mean that there there are other ways to achieve this, whether it's other religions or whether it completely has nothing to do with religion, like it's a completely secular practice of appreciating creativity, appreciating art, appreciating any other sort of thing that you get some sort of deep level of meaning and appreciation for life from.
yes, I do agree with that. So I'm going to take off my Orthodox Christian hat for a second, and just put on my pragmatist, consequentialist hat. Let's say for a second. Okay, so from that perspective, so let's basically assume you're not going to take any of the truth claims of Christianity on faith. So you're just going to talk purely from, without those having to be the basis of your arguments, because those are the epistemological presuppositions that underpin all of Christianity, right? So if you put those two aside for a second, I think it's fairly obvious that there are individuals who have constructed, a belief system, a way of life that is functional for them. I mean, I don't think that's a radical statement, so they have their own conception of beauty, conception of the good, or whatever it is, and it's functional for them. So We can both agree on that, right?
Okay.
Okay.
Good to know.
So that part's pretty clear. So that's by way of agreeing with you that there are multiple paths. Where I see it break down though is I don't know of any way that gets brought to a communal level. Because I had this conversation with my brother recently. If you look at existentialism, and I have to reread some of the Kantian philosophies, but a lot of it sets you up for you as an individual to understand your relationship to the world. But in terms of how you're going to negotiate the whole social dynamic, which is what the body of Christ thing and the liturgy addresses, I don't really see where that's gonna come out. So,
Okay,
like
but
for instance,
this sounds
yeah,
like you mentioned earlier that that there can be a problem with having so many rules. It sounds to me like that you're just concerned about there not being enough rules about how to interact with society. Like especially, well, no, whether you're talking about religious or non-religious perspectives, like atheistic or even just like agnostic or Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, Christian perspectives, you can approach how you interact with society in a wide variety of different ways, many of which can be successful. So I don't think it's necessary
well,
for there to have to be like what you discussed about how you commune with society. I don't think that you need to have any explicit directions about that, because especially because other than what we were just talking about, the like even if someone shares the exact same worldview as you, they could end up failing just as miserably as anyone else with any other worldview in communing with society, just because people are people and we're all very different and we go through a wide variety of different life circumstances regardless of what ideology we have.
I completely agree with you more or less about what you just said. If you look at any given individual, so like so if your unit of analysis is can the individual be happy and functional, fair enough. What I would just juxtapose that against is things like religion when it's taken to become a vehicle for war, for instance, right? So there's or Genghis Khan when you have a belief system or ideology, whatever you want to call it, that allows you to organize human beings to the point where they become a body of an army or a nation or whatever it is, something higher than the individual. So those are constant human creations that we have to contend with, right? They end up like in Canada, we're kind of insulated from that, but for the majority of history, warring tribes was always the case. So
Mm,
with the Christian
it
conception,
depends
if
on
you
what perspective of history you agree with. That's more of
well, I
like
mean, if you
the
go
Steven Pinker Enlightenment sort of view. Like there is sort of different options to believe in terms of that. Like you can go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which which talks about, you know, hunter gatherers being in these egalitarian societies, or you could even go with Robert Sapolsky, for example, talking about how when Steven Pinker argues that a lot of hunter gatherers were in warring tribes all the time, a lot of more recent anthropological and archaeological evidence has apparently shown that a lot of what was interpreted as war was just males and females fighting or I mean males fighting each other over females. So maybe there certainly was war, but perhaps that wasn't just like the nature and inherent set of humanity.
yeah, well, I actually agree with that. So what I think happened because I did my best to read up on prehistory, right? So in prehistory, you can only classify people by archaeological remains. So usually you name people like the groups are named after either a physical specimen, so that would be like the Celts would be an example of that, or you have like they actually name them by the pottery that they're able to find, right? So what I suspect happened is that you had hunter gatherers, but the evidence kind of shows that eventually, um, like city dwelling people, communal people, eventually, like agricultural revolution, eventually occurred, and eventually over time, that those communal bodies ended up having to control resources because they couldn't move around the way hunter gatherers could, and then that's where you get the war. And I think this is actually exactly what Genesis says happens. Because what I think part of what the fall is that they're describing, the knowledge of good and evil, is if you imagine hunter-gatherers living in some roughly state of harmony, then you have people, oh, wait a second here. If I get a bunch of people to only live on two different types of food, build a command center in a town, and I have a warlord in charge of it, and I conscript the entire population and get them to act as a unit. Okay, now all of a sudden, like Cain does, they say Cain built all the weapons. I think that strain of humanity is the beginning of what we see play out, culminating World War One. Is human beings mastering the material world more and more and more by working together to the point where you eventually have the nuclear bomb being built. So you have that kind of trajectory, right? And that's the trajectory of what happens when human beings organize under some principle, whether it's the village, the polis, the nationality, a god, a belief system, whatever it is, right? Does any of that make sense when I say it that way, or?
Yeah, I think it sounds like you're talking about how they're while communion with society and collectivization can be a good thing, there can also be disastrous consequences like the nuclear bomb, if I'm getting that correct.
Well, it's just see, this is the yeah. So what I'm basically saying is to come all the way back to like the belief system thing. It's like for any given individual, given the society isn't actively killing you, there's many different viable paths. If you don't have to worry about a group of Vikings showing up on your shore or Nazis coming across the border, then the action patterns you can live as an individual, there's a lot of very viable things. But once you have to face the problem of Nazis, Huns, Mongols, warring tribes, now all of a sudden it really matters how you solve that coordination problem amongst the group. And then at that stage, it really does matter which groups can coordinate together better than other groups. Does that make any sense?
Okay, so like as we get larger societies, the ideology that we use for group coordination becomes more important because there are larger consequences to it going wrong.
Yes, and that
Okay.
by definition that limits the viable patterns for the individual.
What? So what is the what? So why is that the case?
Well, because like if the village beside you, if you're in a village where everybody just does their own art and makes their own economy, trades what they want to trade, does it any which way they like, everybody's completely happy, 10 out of 10. It's like it's just amazing, right? That, but if all of a sudden it's like a messenger shows up and goes, well, guess what, guys? The other tribe over there, they're fascists. Okay, they've all decided they're just going to do what they're told to do, and what they've been doing is training and building weapons for the last 10 years. And they're going to show up in a week, and they're going to try to kill all of you. So all of a sudden they're like, okay, so we have this paradise of freedom and balance and love and exchange and all these great things. It's like, but if we're not able to stop those people from killing us, then we're screwed. And that's the story of the Greeks and the Persians. That's the story of the Celts versus the other tribes, the Germans who came over them. That's the story of the Huns. That's almost all of recorded history is a version of this story. There's one group of people with weapons coming to kill you. What are you going to do about it? And so when you have to solve that problem, that's where the coordination aspect becomes very important. So I just think it's a basic limitation on your freedom is if you don't sacrifice a certain amount of it, you run the risk of a group coming to you and you not having enough allies to maintain that freedom.
Wouldn't you say that historically speaking, there are a lot more different perspectives in our modern world today than perhaps there used to be at the start of societies or civilizations?
In what sense do you mean more different perspectives?
Like a wider variety of different religious perspectives within those religions, and a wider variety of non-religious perspectives, and a wider variety of political perspectives, perhaps.
There is here, but not in China, for instance.
Okay, so if in some places there are a lot more different perspectives, and in some places there are not, like would you say that China works better as a society than our more of a Western society that has more pluralistic perspective? Because if that is the case, then it doesn't seem to me like it has to be the case that if we have larger societies, it's more important to have a cohesive ideology that everyone follows, because it still works just as well, perhaps, to have a lot of different ideologies.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, like that's and like so when the Americans drafted the Declaration of Independence, right? There's what they tried to say is like, look, this is a government of the people. It's designed to maintain these freedoms to allow us to worship the way we want to, trade the way we want to. The only reason it's there is to make sure we keep having these freedoms. So the only like the only the in a more like traditional sense, the only freedom, the only power we're giving to you, government, is the power to make sure I retain my freedom. So if some other country attacks me, you're going to defend me. If somebody tries to steal my property, you're going to defend that. If I have to go to court, you're going to make sure due process occurs. But you're not going to come tell me what to say, what to think, who to marry, any of those things. You're going to leave me to do that. You know, and but in exchange, you have to pay some amount of tax to maintain that. You have to vote in representatives to go to the government to make sure they don't change the laws. So that's kind of that's the social contract. Whoever invented that expression, right? That's that whole idea. So it's like depending on your situation, you could have a social contract that allows you to have a lot of freedom. If all of a sudden it's time to conscript your civilization to fight off Hitler, then maybe your social contract has to change, and maybe you have to decide to become a property of the state and go follow orders in a trench for 3 years, and maybe that's worth doing. Maybe it's not. It's up for each individual to decide based on what values we want to have. So it's sort of bring it full circle back to what we were talking about at the beginning. It's like when you answer that question, well, what are viable paths to live a good life? It really depends. Well, what do you value? Like 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 and we all have our own decisions about that. But I mean, if you want to have like an insurance policy in case you do get attacked, then you have to sacrifice a certain amount of your time and not be doing whatever it is, and actually making sure that you have a group of men or men and women who, if for whatever reason somebody comes to attack us, we're going to be there to do something about it. Or if somebody comes to throw us in jail illegally, we're going to protest it. If you don't invest in setting up those systems, then there are certain possibilities open up for your future. Hello?
I forgot
Hello?
that I was muted. Sorry. It
No
sounds
worries.
like you're basically saying that it's important to have some government structures or some communal groups and organizations that get things done, the bare essentials for society, basically.
Well, you might want to take it into account, right? It's up to you to decide. So like, to come back to like originally, we're like, well, what, like, are there other paths to live? It's like it might be completely viable to just for somebody to just focus on their art, focus on loving their friends and family, and then never concern themselves with the communal aspect. And that might work for 5 generations. And if you're an evolutionist, it's a completely viable way to go. But then you could hit a bottleneck, and if you want to use evolutionary language, and the bottleneck could be the Great War, and certain people will have developed schemas and patterns to deal with that. Other people won't. So what was viable as a good life, all of a sudden that artist might wake up one day as his city's getting shelled, or the people on horseback are shooting arrows, and whatever time period you're in, and he might say, geez, you know what, that whole military, those people I used to make fun of marching down the street in lines, and who I refused to cooperate with, I'm kind of regretting that now because my paintings are on fire, and I just saw my sister get hit by an arrow. It's like, shit. So maybe the good life that I thought was the good life actually turns out it wasn't. So
Okay.
yeah. So, and then the reason I brought that up is that I feel like a weakness of these things that could replace old school religion is that because we've lived in such peaceful times, and because we've had a relatively well organized government for the last 100 years, it's like those particular risks or problems didn't really need to be sorted out. And it's only now that we're seeing, like, in my opinion, that's what we're seeing with the social justice warriors. It's like we took free will for granted free speech for granted for so long, due process for granted for so long. There were a lot of these processes that were just humming along in the background, and the me generation was like, I don't need to worry about that. I can just go work my job, get my paycheck, think about my retirement. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, geez, the bankers ripped off all our money. They're inflating their prices. It's like a bunch of people now want to pass laws that tell me what to say, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's
That's a
like, oh,
that's a really reductionistic argument, actually, especially like from a religious perspective. That sounds really reductionistic. Like we go, we decide. You said the me generation, and then all of these terrible things happen. And to me, like the I agree with the like it's sort of Nietzsche's argument, really, when he talks about the death of God, that the like the way religion is practiced as society and valued by society as a whole is gone, and there are other ideologies that are going to take its place. I don't think that I don't think that that's inherently a bad thing, and I don't think that that proves that the religious structures are the inherently best way to go too. I think that there are lots of different solutions, whether they're religious or not religious, that may work or may not work, and it's really hard to tell which ones are inherently better or worse, especially since a lot of them, well, they always have to do with a lot of historical circumstances that are constantly changing.
yeah. Well, I completely agree with that. So that's what I was trying to set up is I was, by giving those examples, it's not inherently the case a priori before the fact that the the artist who only loves his family and friends and his art is better or worse than the person who works his job and makes sure his taxes go to fund all the communal structures. One isn't inherently better than the other. You can't know. But from like a pragmatic philosophy standpoint, is you see throughout history and you see in reality, people, this is a live experiment that's actually being played out. And because it's so complicated, usually the best you can do to answer such big questions is you can't have a control group of one society structuring itself one way and a experimental group doing it a different way, and you can't tweak the variables. We haven't figured out how to do it yet, right? But what we can say is that we can look at how those experiments have played out in real time in societies. So, and my contention there is that it's like, just like Nietzsche said, right? Like Nietzsche made a diagnosis. He said, look, if we don't have this unifying God underward, something's going to fill that gap. And I think we can both agree on a variety of things that have filled that gap. Some of them we really don't like. Some of them are possibly other viable things. So I do believe that it's conceivable, like you say. It's not inherently the case that there's no inherent reason why there can't be other patterns that could work out. I just don't know of any one that's been proposed that's communal, that's actually playing out viably, right? Like
What do you mean?
I mean, like think of like a communal belief system that people.
Secular humanism, there's one.
Okay, well, what's an example of secular humanism in society?
Everyone who calls himself a secular humanist and goes to those secular humanist conferences, and they have a really distinct moral value structure in the same way that a lot of religious people do. I'm not advocating for this, but I'm saying that's an example.
Yeah, okay, that's an example. Okay, well, I'll just contrast it with a couple other examples of ideologies. Okay, Mormons, like they have physical buildings, resources, educational loans, business opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, the social justice warrior kind of mentality. They hire each other. They interact on universities and they set up things specifically because they're on the equity team. And I don't know if you know the story of Evergreen, right?
Yeah,
There
of
you can
course.
actually see very, very tangible manifestation of we all follow this equity belief system. Or my language is clumsy, but I think you get what I mean, right? I
Okay.
would just say it's a lot more loosey goosey when you
Well,
talk about secular humanists
y-
because it
yeah,
does because a secular humanist, like, so like for instance, like in social justice warrior, it's like you have very explicit things that you have to agree on, like they have a creed. It's not a lot of things, but there's something in the creed. In the secular humanist point of view, The creed is so broad that you underneath it you could act out almost completely different lifestyles. Like you're not. What are you obligated to do as a secular humanist? Like what would somebody have to do to no longer be part of the secular humanist collective? Like what would that take?
Well, probably
And
like answers that you would consider really obvious, like murdering someone or raping someone or going against basically the same sort of religious values that you would get from religion, basically, but they just look at them from a completely non-religious context. And like the way you were describing it, like in terms of Mormons, for example, or if you want to go with like a really obviously bad interpretation of religion, like the Westboro Baptist Church of Christianity, for example, like you could easily argue that this social justice mentality, that sort of ideology, being just the Westboro Baptist Church version of a secular ideology.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would agree. Yeah. So there's bad examples. So and I agree with you in terms of secular humanism. It's like yes, they establish those baseline, like 10 Commandment level specificity of goals. But in terms of secular humanists, you go, okay, what do you do if somebody murders somebody? Some people say restorative justice. They're still a secular humanist. Somebody might say death penalty. Somebody might say lock them up for 20 years. Somebody might say lock them up for 5. Somebody might say balance of probabilities evidence system for dealing with sexual harassment, committing adultery or a sexual sin. Other people might say no, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. It's like, oh, but the woman doesn't have any proof. It's like, oh, too bad, due process. They're all secular humanists, but like secular humanism doesn't have a huge power to drill down to specifics because it is such a broad kind of global label.
Why is it a bad thing to have a lot of different perspectives and continuously debate about which one is best? Like that's what philosophy is for. The entirety of philosophy.
Well, it's not inherently bad. It comes back to that point earlier. It's like it really depends on what level of coordination do you need, right? So in certain points of time, in times of peace, diversity of ideas, very, very valuable. When things get desperate, like for instance, global warming would be a great example. Okay, that's a challenge. That's a challenge where it's like, whoa, all of a sudden our diversity is no longer our strength. Because if this is actually a problem, we need large scale unified action. How do we do that? Right? Now, like for argument's sake, if everybody was, if Islam decided, if somebody, like if the leaders of Islam decided that there are, if they could claim that the same way Muhammad doesn't want a picture of himself, he doesn't want all these global warming policies. You could imagine they could roll out that solution and unify everybody around it, quite easily. By comparison with secular humanists, the amount of debate, and this is what we're seeing happening in reality, the amount of debate about what to do is huge. Some people try to hijack it to implement socialism. Some people hijack it just to make money. Some people hijack it to pay their friends to install solar panels. Some people try to do it earnestly, but they don't actually know what to do. And some people just, sail across the ocean and yell about it a bunch.
Okay.
And
well, the same
like,
thing could be said about basically any perspective. Like in the same way that you were just describing that Islam and secular humanism could be used in a variety of different ways, including very bad ways. Probably better than I do that orthodoxy has been used for the worst possible views, like mass genocide historically, which doesn't mean that it's inherently bad, of course, in the same sense that it doesn't mean that Islam and secular humanism are inherently bad.
Yeah. So I don't think we're disagreeing here. The only point I wanted to make is that if figuring out how to live your individual life, I don't think it's often acknowledged that this provides a problem for solving large scale communal problems. And the example I always use is when I went to my geography 101 class that was an elective I took in university. And the very first class, the geography tree hugger teacher, he put up a model of culture. He had values, heritage, common narratives, common history. And he's like, why am I telling you about these things? Is this a sociology class all of a sudden? I thought this was geography, right? And the class is like, yeah, why are you? It's like, well, if we don't share a common story, then we're not going to be able to agree on a common problem. And if we can't even agree on a common problem, then how are we ever going to agree on a common solution?
Well, that's
So
not
I
true
was,
though, because a lot of people cannot agree on, can have totally different ideologies, but agree on a common problem, but just have different ways of solving it. Like that actually happens a fair amount when you see like conservatives who are willing to talk to liberals and liberals who are willing to talk to conservatives. A lot of the time, they actually agree on the problem, but they think that there are different ways to solve it. Like for example, did you like in Canada, none of our prime minister candidates, when they were talking about climate change, none of them were denying that climate change is a problem that needs to be solved. They were proposing different solutions to it. And you see this with a lot of other problems too, like in the American presidential debates when they talk about healthcare, they all agree that it needs to be better, but they want different solutions.
yeah. I'm not disagreeing with you. It's just when like different examples. It's like the climate change problem. It's like you need a high degree of coordination in theory, if you want to do it quickly. So that would be an example.
Hmm.
Driving a car. It's like you don't want diversity of opinions about where the wheels should be going. You want one person to control that. If you're in a military situation, that's why it's orders. Because in
Hmm.
that situation, diversity of opinion has its limits. Now, but then I don't know if you listen to Yoko Willink at all, but
Yeah,
the American military has to kind of, well, like Yoko talks about. Well, but if you're more organized and you're really well drilled, then you actually can have time for your second in command to push back. And then if you're a really good leader, you can rise above the laws. You can get up to the principal level. And so there always is, your point is always valid. There always is a value for diversity. There's always going to be examples where the diversity can be harnessed, and people can see across different their own different ways of living and unify them to solve problems. It happens all
let's
the
be
time.
let's be clear that I'm talking about intellectual diversity too. I'm not talking
Yeah, yeah,
about.
no, yeah.
I'm not
Oh, yeah, that's
talking
what I
about.
meant, of course.
I know that you know that. I want to clarify for people watching this. I'm
Yeah.
not. I'm not
Well,
talking about
and that's like,
diversity in terms of anyone's skin color or gender or sexual
no, of course not.
orientation or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the beautiful thing about like capitalism, right? Like you can have super serious real estate agents and developers hire a building. Then you could have people who are kind of good at business, living all sorts of different lives, installing drywalls. A bunch of drug addicts who can't get any other job but sanding come in and do sanding for a day. Because they're all those and then you could have people of all different lifestyles come and live in those units, and despite all these different ways of living, in a huge variety, the building goes from an empty piece of land to filled with a bunch of happy people. So like we solve these problems all the time. It's but we do that. We're able to do that because we have a economic system and a rule of law governing it, right? So there's always that push and pull between conformity and coordination and abilities and the advantages and the ability to integrate individualism and diversity, right? There's always that
Yeah,
trade-off, and
like
it's always going to fall down to,
finding a balance, right?
yeah. So and then it come assuming we've gone down this cul-de-sac or this roundabout long enough to bring it back to what we originally got onto this. I think that when you talk about other viable life patterns, I think um, individual viable life patterns have become pretty sophisticated. There's a lot of diversity there. Like a lot of people have figured out a lot of viable ways for individuals to live. I would just say that it's the level of sophistication on the communal integrative level isn't it has not caught up in the West as much as it has in as much as it could. There's a lot more room for growth in that realm, because I think a lot of leading Western thought is really focused on the individual unit of analysis. Um, I don't think that's that contentious a claim. I think it's pretty apparent that that's the focus of modern Western society is really
Hmm.
at individual level.
Yeah, yeah,
So
that's for sure. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, yeah, we definitely agree that there should be a balance between um, between the value of the individual perspective versus the value of the collective, and that any ideology can be used for good or bad purposes or anything in between.
Yeah. So to kind of blow your mind a little bit, or is like there is no such thing as an individual in Orthodox worldview.
Okay.
Like because you are part of a body. Like when you
You're
marry
part
your
of
wife,
a
you literally become one body of Christ.
you're you're a collection of many of countless individual parts through an endless process of change from the time before you were born until the time long after you die, even
Yeah.
scientifically speaking, because there was the Big Bang, and then it eventually led to you, and then long after you die, the remains of your body will be integrated back into the earth
Yeah.
and the universe.
Well, and I take this even further. For myself, like I sometimes joke, how old am I? I'm a billion years old because I'm an unbroken chain of life. So it
Mm-hmm.
seems really significant to draw a line between when I change from sperm and an egg into what we call Shane. But when you think of the majority of my architecture, the majority of what controls me and what chooses my behavior, most of that's biological. So that's a direct extension from my quote unquote previous life. And like there's this veneer of Shaneness on top of it. But the vast majority of what I things to do aren't really that unique from a human point of view. Most of what I do is almost what everyone does is that. So I think I don't know. I would go so far as to say it's much more the case that you're this. It's a much more. I think descriptively, it's more accurate to view an individual as actually this series of individuals that is more or less one thing than it really is to view it as an individual, especially when you consider that majority of names in history are gone, right? Most of what we know is this moving mass of humanity and what it's doing, and all the little blinking stars are kind of just that. But I don't know if that makes sense,
No,
but
that makes sense. I agree. Yeah, that makes total sense.
yeah. So okay, so do you want to? I don't know. Like I'm. Oh, geez, I'm pretty far from home. I'm just walking. So yeah, I don't know. I'm having a good time. I don't know how much more time you have, but
I
you
could
need to riff on something.
Yeah, we could talk a little bit longer. I only just barely started getting into that first quote, and then we went a long way from there. But yeah, we could go just a little bit longer
Yeah, why
if
don't you
you
just do
want
a
to.
couple more sentences and then we'll
Yeah,
call it quits.
sure. Let me go back to this here because I closed it on my phone, and
No
we
worries.
probably in our long discussion that led to went over some of the other questions that I already had.
Yeah, we
So
probably did. We might be able to cover a bit more ground
let me
more
see
quickly. We'll
here.
see how she goes.
Um, so God is not an idea that one proves, but a being in relation to whom one lives, seeking. Oh, yeah, this is one part we were talking about. Seeking proofs is blasphemy, and making Christianity seem credible is the destruction of Christianity. And I think you had explained that seeking proofs in a materialistic scientific way, is something that can be more likely to lead to blasphemy. I think that's what you were saying before when we were talking about this and clarifying that, and that
Yeah.
making Christianity credible is similar, that it can be more likely to lead to that. Those are two claims that are, like, to be totally honest, just sound kind of ridiculous to me.
Well, in yes, if you pick like at face value just by themselves, if you just plump down those two sentences and that's all you read, yes. But what he's getting at there is if you do that in a reductionist sense, because if you follow those things through, like if you're going to reduce Christianity to a set of laws, so you're going to lose the principles. You're gonna turn it back into a covenant of laws, and you're going to turn it into just a rational proposition,
Well,
and that's
this
not
this
what it's.
again this again sounds like a mechanistic explanation. Like, if you do this, it will lead to this.
Okay, well, that's this is my error of speaking. It's like that's the danger of doing that.
Why
You
is
know,
it
it's
why
like
is it a
it's
danger?
well, that's what the story of the Tower of Babel it exemplifies. It's like if you try to build a totality, like a system that can account for anything, or if you try to build a full explanation for things, which is impossible. But if you seek out to do that, it's very dangerous, because ultimately you're going to be leaving things out, and those are the very things that are going to come back to be your undoing. I don't know if that, like, this is an extremely dense topic. This is Peterson spent like an hour talking about this in terms of what is he in terms of problem with ideologies in general. Like,
So
because if you yeah.
that sounds to me like, in a way, I think I was saying this before actually, that the one thing I can appreciate about both of those is that they sound more honest than some other theological Christian perspectives on this, because they would perhaps assume to prove God's existence and make Christianity credible, where in reality it sounds like you're just being more honest and saying, no, I'm just taking it on faith. I'm not trying to prove anything, which obviously I don't share that faith, but I kind of respect that in a way.
Well, I think that's the way to go. Like one of my favorite stories is again that same Coptic priest, Abuna Joseph. So did I tell you the story where he's in Egypt and he's being asked his business plan? Did I tell you this before?
I'm not sure.
Okay, so he's in Egypt, and they're asking him. So a lot of like people starting churches nowadays are starting to incorporate like a business mentality, and you can imagine why, right? Because what do businesses do? They grow their user base. They have metrics. It seems to be working. And so it's like, why not just borrow some business concepts and put them into the church? And what you might want to do is make Christianity sound credible. You might want to have a good pitch, and you might want to have like a mission statement to guide your pitch, so you can have this little rational framework of rules or of explicit things to get more of the Christianity that you want. So, and this is kind of the opposite of what I think is the correct approach. So anyways, they ask Abuna Joseph, they say, what's your mission statement? And he's like, oh, you don't want to know my mission statement. It's not very interesting. And they're in Egypt, right? And he's like, oh no, you're from North America. We really want to hear what you think. He's like, oh well, I guess my mission statement is, my plan with my church is I'm just going to repent, and I'm hoping that if I repent fully, that more people will repent too, and that's my plan. And they're like, oh, okay. And they just ask the
Why
next person,
why repenting?
because what it is instead of making Christianity sound credible, it's just like, I'm going to act like Christ. I'm going to be humble, admit my faults, and then ask for forgiveness, and hopefully through that process I can become a better person. And
That's
that's what
not a
Christ
that's not a that's not a way of trying to make Christianity seem credible to yourself. Because of, like, if you weren't doing that otherwise, why would you do that practice?
well so that again that comes back to, like, it's part of the problem is that that's just one sentence we're looking at, but it's like how are you going to make it credible? Are you going to make it credible by showing it, or by explaining it? Like that's kind of where my thinking's at. It's like, and I'm not knocking any other Christian approach, but I don't think a good idea is to go out there and go, hey, you know what? I might still be a hypocrite. I might still be a bad person. Like, you're obviously going to meet me, and I have all these flaws. But here I'm going to tell you, you know what? Jesus saves, and you want to do this Jesus thing, and I'm going to have all these arguments, and they're going to look at you, and they're going to go, well, dude, you seem the exact same as me. You're living basically the same life as me, except you're telling this Christian story, and you're telling me to buy into it. Well, why? And you're trying to convince me that's the way to go. To me, I don't think that's the right approach anymore. What I think is somebody actually living out that piece, exuding that, showing like they're actually a living example of God, because you can see God in that person, because they are loving, they are treating people good. You can see them doing good things. You can see that they're at peace. You can see it all in their repenting, and they're acting out that life. And then you could go, wow, I don't have to. It's not at that point. It's like you can make it rational, but you're actually seeing what they're talking about, and then you can decide for yourself whether you want to learn more about it, and have your own relationship with God like that person has. But I think that's where Christianity is at its strongest, is when you see a bunch of Christians with happy families doing missionary work, feeding the poor, running hospitals, which they invented. When they're doing that stuff, that's when Christianity sinks, because it no longer becomes a theoretical explanation of the Trinity. It's like you see it right there. You see God acting on earth. So
Okay.
that
Well,
kind of comes back. Yeah.
I like this idea that correct me if I'm wrong, that it's better to just live by example than evangelize, and if people want to follow your example, that's good. But I also like when you're talking about how this is living proof when you live by this example and you become this goal of I don't know if enlightened is the right word, but you develop a relationship of God, or
Illuminated.
however, sorry,
Illuminated would be the right word, I think.
become illuminated. Then if you say that you can just tell by looking at it, that sounds like an empiricist approach, and like the empiricist approaches can be really flawed because we're evolutionarily designed to chunk information and miss bits of information. So there's pretty much undeniably always something that we're missing when we look at someone manifesting in the image of God or Jesus and saying that this is proof. And it also like it, I guess you said before it's okay to try to make Christianity seem credible if you do it by living by example like that. But I still don't understand um, why that would be proof of like living that way would be proof of God or proof of Jesus being a really good way to become illuminated.
Well, I mean, because I'll just some people don't like analogy. I like analogies. So it's like if I were to explain why parties are fun to you, and tell you about it, explain it to you, draw a map of it, have a model of it, have statistical evidence that parties are fun. That's one thing. If you go to a party and have fun, you get it. You know, like it's it's
Okay.
it's like, you know what I mean. So it's kind of like that, which is like, I can explain to you why my Christian lifestyle is going to solve all my problems, going to make me the best person ever, and going to make me the best neighbor. And I can explain it to you rationally. I can model it. I can provide all this evidence why that's the case, and that's one thing. Or you could see me being a great Christian, and then the proof's in the pudding, you know.
Well,
And
don't you still not know whether all of those good results are actually caused by your Christianity or not? Couldn't a lot of those things be at least have a wide variety of other contributing factors? And isn't it possible that none of those good effects are due to Christianity, or even minimal?
yes, it's definitely possible. And I think, especially when you want to talk about something that's complicated, it's like, because you're like, I think like human beings are designed to recognize what's true and real. Like that's like we're pattern recognizers, right? That's what our survival is based on, is assessing situations and interacting with them, and hopefully our interactions create the results we want. Like that's what we're built to do. That's what our survival depends on. So evolution's tuned us to do that. So you can, and a modern invention of evolution is this rational capacity to abstract and to make evidence and learn in that way. But I would put forward that if you want to answer a question like that and map out that causality, it's probably much easier to get an intuitive grasp. That's probably going to come true first before the rational thing, which lines up very much with what Haidt says too, is most people end up drawing conclusions from what they intuitively embodied believe, from their experiences. And then the rational
Mhm.
part comes in later and explains why that's the case. So I would put forward that probably for a lot of people, unless you're very smart or very able to think scientifically, which is hard, the best proof you're going to get is that embodied truth from experiencing and living and engaging your whole being with something. That's more likely the resonance from that is going to give you a clearer signal than the resonance from an abstraction in a book telling you about it.
But we
For
can't
most
we,
people,
we can't
most things.
we can't trust we can't really necessarily trust our intuitions though. Like I know you were talking about, and I agree with Jonathan Haidt's perspective on how our rationalizations are driven by our intuitions. But to me, that just means that the Orthodox view or any other view really is just as equally biased as any other view, because we can't really trust our intuitions.
Well, see, so that's where the purification comes in. So, so fundamentally, yes, I do agree with you. Um, and what I have two things to say about that is one, ultimately, sooner or later, decisions end up having to be made. So, like, either you can't know if the bridge is going to hold, but ultimately you're going to step on the bridge and get across the river, or the forest fire behind you is going to burn you alive. At some point you have to act on assumptions, right? So yes, despite the mechanism being flawed, there's a lot of situations where sooner or later you either do A or B or do nothing, which is C, right? So you're kind of
Wouldn't
stuck.
those be rare situations which don't necessarily even require you having any consistent conscious worldview, because you're just going to act intuitively when that sort of example kicks in, like you said, like you're going to flee from the forest fire without thinking about
Yeah.
it, which
Well,
doesn't
yeah.
necessarily have to do
Yeah.
with anything you believe.
Well, I'm saying implicitly, either knowingly or unknowingly, either aware of it or unaware of it, you're acting on assumptions all the time.
Yes.
So faulty. So that's just a constant. So I'm just saying that that's just a truth of every decision has this problem. It's not unique to claims that Orthodox make or scientific claims. It's a constant problem that runs through every single human reality. So it's kind of a universal. It's kind of a wash between all problems. But one of the ways that the Orthodox try to limit that doubt factor is by purifying yourself. And what that means is, to the extent that you're not being governed by impulses and by your passions, you can you're going to see things more clearly. So one really practical example of that is just in my own life. I'll use my own examples of some of the things that I need to purify. Like, if you're constantly in mentally stressed or anxious or depressed, or when you're constantly listening to podcasts or YouTube, well, the odds of you seeing the world more clearly are lower, because your mental energy is going to analyze these videos and these podcasts. You're less present. If you're drinking on the regular, your memory's worse, your concentration's worse. Again, you're going to see the world less clearly. So this purification step in Christianity is this attempt to, by minimizing where your attention's being sucked up by other things and your will's being sucked up by other things, you have more of that will and that vision to actually see the true things around you. And then that's what they mean by being illuminated. You could
I
actually
don't think
see things
I
for
don't
what they
think
really
this
are, because
sorry.
yeah.
Sorry.
No, go on. That's pretty much
I
it.
don't think this necessarily has anything inherently to do with purification or illumination. It's just about, like, trying to improve your flaws, and also, like, to, well, it does make sense to not just be driven by your passions and do everything. Like, that part where you said about, like, not being too led by your passions sounds oddly rationalistic for the way that I've heard you describe orthodoxy so far.
Well, I mean, it's kind of what's that word? Tautological, right? Like,
Yeah.
if like for a scientist, purification. If your value is fact-based scientific knowledge, purification in that framework would be: I'm not watching TV. I'm not playing the flute. I'm building a better data set to generate better facts from. In a Christian sense, if you want to see truly what is the good thing and what's the bad thing, then not being distracted by these sets of things enable that level of illumination to go along better. So the basic idea is that if you want to minimize that inherent uncertainty, then you got to hone your sensor, you got to hone your lens, and you do that by freeing up more intention to focus on those things. If you given whatever your paradigm you want to operate on, right? So like that's part of the reason why artists let themselves be consumed by their art, because if they're not, they're not going to reach that next level, right? The odds of you being able to never have done art, wake up one day, put in 1 hour, and then manifest the most amazing art in the world is very unlikely, right? So I
So
don't really know what to say about the rationalistic part of it, but I mean, obviously we're rationalistic creatures, so like, it's not the worst thing. And like, there is definitely efforts in orthodoxy to explain things in coherent ways. There's just also that respect to know that there's limits to it. So
okay. Well, I still I understand that, but I still don't see the reason for even the need for the word purification unless you're looking at it from a religious perspective. And it's not as if the only options are the religious or the rationalistic perspective. I'm just talking about generally in terms of language, even if you don't look at it rationally at all. I don't see the need for the word purification for describing that process of, self-improvement. Basically, that doesn't mean
Well,
that doesn't mean that I'm telling no one to have that. Of course, I'm just saying that doesn't seem like it's any inherently superior way to describing it.
well, it's based on your goal, right? Like, look what you've achieved with your body, right? Like, to achieve that, you had to purify your physical routine in the sense of get rid of a certain amount of lazy inactivity and replace it with physical working out. Probably the same thing with your diet. You had to probably purify your diet, and certain foods uh, couldn't
But
be
you're
had,
just
and certain foods.
using this word. Like, I understand what you mean by it.
Yeah.
I think we just use that word differently.
Well, I mean, why do they use the word purification? I think when I think of purification, I picture like a test tube, and certain things are being burnt off, and then there's a more concentrated thing left behind. So like like in terms of, I just want to stick with something where I think it applies to you with the working out thing. You burnt off certain amounts of laziness and a certain amount of crap food, and what was left behind was more physical activity and better inputs into your body. And given if your goal is to have the physique you have to go through that process. So if you don't like the word purification, that's fine. But visually, I do. It's very easy for me to see the fatty foods and the laziness burning away in a beaker as the heat of purification is being applied, and what's left behind is that photo you post on Facebook. So I don't know. It just makes sense to me. So
No, I understand. I'm not telling you to use the word. I'm just saying
yeah,
that I totally understand the process without needing to understand it in the way that you do. I just don't look at it from that sort of metaphorical way, adding the imagery of purification.
yeah.
Um, I
Well,
just think
because
it. I
you're
just
not an
think it.
Orthodox Christian yet.
Yeah, I just think it's to me it's just self-improvement. But
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
But yeah, we could go over maybe one or two more things here, and then I think I might be done for tonight. But I think
yeah. I think so too.
yeah. So let me see. Maybe we could go through one or two more things that were in these passages here. So let
Yeah,
me
pick whatever you
see.
like. Let's do the ultimate here.
Okay. So we must choose between living and existing in the strongest sense of the second term. Our destiny is to be placed within the dialectic of the second capital P person of the divine thou. Oh, yeah, that's one thing I asked you about. I don't remember whether you responded to it or what your response was. What's the divine thou?
I think that's probably God.
Okay.
That's a that's a really jargon laced sentence. That one would be hard to unpack. I don't know if that's the
So,
best one to pick, but we can.
so our destiny is to be placed within the dialectic of God? What does that mean?
Well, that's that whole Christ in you thing is to
So
exist in that
you want Christ to come inside you and be married to you.
yeah, exactly, yeah, exactly, yes.
Okay. Um, so let me see. So you're bisexual then? That's interesting.
Well, God
Nothing
doesn't
wrong
have
with
sex.
that. What?
God doesn't have sex. God doesn't have sex.
Okay. Um, faith is never a mere intellectual assent, but a fidelity of the person to the person. What? Oh, is that like kind of what you were just saying? That thing of being like one with Jesus or God or something like that?
Yeah, it's acting it out. It's acting it
Okay.
out. So it's so like and I think the thing is like even for somebody like Sam Harris, right, who might be very hesitant to say he does anything on faith. It's like, well, at the base, he has some base assumptions about what's good, and he has a label for it: humanism and rationality and empiricism. and he has an image of how those people act, and he embodies that. A Christian has their own version with their own prepositions at the bottom, and they act those things out. So that's the true definition of faith is that it's not just it's acting those ideas out, which is an existentialist idea, like Sartre's idea. Like, you are your actions. You're not declared beliefs. You are the things you act out. So, yeah,
Okay.
Orthodox is very, very focused on, it's like, yeah, it's all well and good to have all these things you say and all these things you proclaim. That's all nice, and we might explain it. But at the end of the day, it's like, is Christ in you? Are you loving your neighbor? Are you doing that? If you're doing that, that's faith. That's the important part. So,
Okay. Now, at the end of that paragraph, it kind of talks it basically talks about how marriage is really good and awesome, and I don't know whether the guy means in that paragraph that the marriage, as you were describing, like the marriage between you and Jesus and God, and letting God and Jesus embody you, is what they mean by marriage, or does he also mean like marriage as in people actually getting married? And
both.
if both, okay, so why is marriage such a good thing?
Well, marriage is such a good thing because a complete human being is the harmonious unity of a man and a woman.
Why?
Because that's because, like, for instance, so when God made Adam, that was a whole human being. Okay, and then when God took the rib out of Adam and made Eve, he divided the common humanity into two separate halves. And what marriage does is allows those two halves to come back together, and that's the best. That's the full human being is Christ, a man and a woman together in
Isn't
marriage.
it allowing the marriage, allowing two people to come back together, isn't that kind of destroying the entirety of human existence symbolically by doing that, because you're sort of negating the very process that caused it to happen in the first place?
Well, that's the reunification post fall that God's trying to achieve, is to bring everybody back into that unity while they're still in some way separate. But
Why
like
not just
literally,
have them unified from the first place and not change it?
because then God wouldn't have given us free will. We wouldn't be made in His image. Without human choice, then in my opinion, it becomes a meaningless exercise. Because if there isn't something choosing to do it, you can't have love. So like,
Okay.
even within a big part of the reason that they need the Trinity is if there isn't the different parts of the Trinity, then there's nothing to love the other thing. If the Father doesn't love the Son, there is no love. It's just because love
Why?
has to be between.
Why?
Well, because by definition, love is between two things. Like because like because so the Christian definition of love
Before
is
God created
self-sacrificial.
humans, there wasn't any love.
There was a love that God had in the Trinity.
So there was God. So it sounds like you don't even need the Trinity, unless you're saying that the Trinity is love. And why would God have
Trinity
had
is
the
love, yes.
Trinity? Why would God have had the Trinity with love before creating humans? And why is it even necessary?
I think a big part of it is beauty. To be honest, it's like not fashionable to like think of beauty as an end goal, but if you look back, like I noticed my priest in the class would say it all the time, and it's just like in justifying why this thing he's saying is great. It's just as simple as it's beautiful. It's just inherently capital G good. Love is inherently beautiful. Beauty has its own value, and in a modern utilitarian kind of pragmatic sense, I think that's kind of got lost from our lexicon. But like, things being beautiful and that being an end in and of itself, I think is a genuinely thing we've kind of lost in society, to be honest. And
Okay.
like, love for love's sake, is I think very, very valuable. I'm a bit of a romantic in this sense, so.
I think that's good too, but I don't think there's actually any justifiable reason for you or I believing that, even though I do. I just don't think that there's actually any real reason. I just choose to take that on faith, but not with any religious sense. But I choose to take it on faith that the religious explanation or any other and is not valid to me, but I don't know of any explanation, and I don't think there even really needs to be one, pragmatically speaking.
Well,
And
see, that's okay. Sorry, go on. I shouldn't cut you off.
I also wanted to go back to, you were talking about how this their love, this reunification has to be achieved by a man and a woman. Now, the obvious thing to say in that case is that it doesn't seem to me like it inherently has to be a union between a man and a woman. I don't see a, like, if you're talking about Adam and Eve, for example, that also seems kind of reductionistic to just say that it has to be a union between a man and a woman. Like, does it say anywhere that it can't be a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, or a man and a badger, or a girl or a woman and a dragon?
Well, what I would put forward is that there are different. The word they use is vocations. So this is something I think you would appreciate. So there are different vocations. So for instance, somebody, because especially once you're in the body of Christ, there's a unity to be had there. So you can within that community, you can complete yourself in a lot of variety of ways. So so you don't have to marry a woman if you're a man, or marry a man as a woman. There are other options.
Okay. So it doesn't
So
have to be the unity of a man and a woman to achieve that reunification then.
it's not the only way, but for the vast majority of people, what they are is something designed to be unified with the opposite sex. So there are
That sounds
exceptions,
like
but
a
no.
tautology.
Well, yes, it is, because that is like, because it's an ontological definition of what a human being is. So, like, for instance, like, you need a next generation, for example. So, to some extent, by definition, for humanity to continue, you do need some amount of this. So we're just basically saying, well,
You need
how?
some breeding.
Yeah, exactly. You need some amount of it. So
But
no matter
but
which,
breeding can
yeah.
happen without marriage, right? Plus, like, it could even happen if there were like literally only like half a dozen, like, say it were the opposite way of reality, and say that in reality the majority of people were homosexual, or, well, I guess homosexual would be a good example for this for this broader example. But say the vast majority of people were homosexual and only 10% of society, or even like 1%, were heterosexual, you still would be able to carry on the species.
Yes. Okay. So this is where we're going to end up in some. This is very much is analogous to that whole thing I talked about earlier with the. There's no inherent reason it has to be this way. It's just what's going to end up happening when you run into certain problems, right? So, for instance, like I'm a child of divorce. Okay, had a huge, most of the people I know who have come through divorces, and there's also a lot of scientific literature to back this up, has a lot of very negative repercussions on children. Okay, so it's pretty much true in the majority of cases. It's better for parents to stick together than
Mhm.
not. There are
Well,
exceptions,
I've
granted.
seen I've seen a lot of studies that show very similar to what you're saying, probably, which is that it's better for childhood developments for them to be in households with two parents. But I don't think it actually says in any of those studies necessarily that it has to be two parents, that one of which is a man and one of which is a woman.
That's true. That literature still hasn't been developed yet. That's absolutely true. So we're on the same page. So okay. So if we can agree that for the majority of cases, it's better to have two people in a household, then the question becomes, okay, what structure of relationship between those two people is the most likely to continue to foster those positive benefits we agree that happen. So the Christian, and they have a whole bunch of defense for this, which we get into, but the Christian contention is that the type of unity you can have in a quote unquote complete human being, unified in the type of love as Christians conceive of it, that is the best unit to face all those challenges and to most likely have that occur. So if you want to maximize the possibility of that union of children and parents working out, the best vehicle to do that is marriage, is their
Okay.
contention.
marriage, but you're saying that it doesn't have to be. Well, wait. You're saying marriage between a man and a woman.
But
Unless you're saying that it doesn't have to be between a man and a woman. There's no evidence that it has to be a man and a woman.
there's no such thing as marriage that's not between a man and a woman. That's not like in a
Yes,
Christian
there
conception. That's
is.
not a thing. Well,
Okay, but there clearly is, though.
well, it depends what you mean by marriage.
Plus,
Like the type of unity.
I still haven't heard you say why marriage has to happen to continue the species, whereas people clearly don't need to be married to breed.
No, they don't need to be married to breed. But to have sorry, we're getting things. We're on different tracks. We're on multiple tracks here. Marriage is the most successful vehicle to raise good children. It's not the only way to create good people. And good people are the most likely to deal with the challenges of life in a way that works out well.
It doesn't seem to me that why is the marriage the best way to create good people? It seems like you're just going back to that claim.
Yes. So we have to dig into why Christians make that claim. So we might not get through all the logic behind it, but we could start. And a lot of the fundamental logic is that a complete human being is the male-female dyad. And what that gets into is that given that every person has strengths and weaknesses, and there's certain natural, given that every person has strengths and weaknesses, a full person requires a community, requires the whole body of Christ, in fact, requires all of us working together if you want to go completely larger scale. So you need to have you need to have a lot of diversities working together. That's the best thing to do. So
I still don't see any reason for how this has to require marriage, or how this has to require it being between a man and a woman. Like, it seems to me like the most important thing is that the parents love each other, and two people can clearly love each other without being married, because it happens all the time.
They can. What did I say? It's okay. So we're in something that you can't. We're in a realm that you can't make everything explicit. Like the science isn't there yet. Okay. So we're obviously gonna be making claims and assertions that aren't going to be completely backed up by evidence, right? But I think the logic goes something along the lines of is in a Christian conception of marriage, because it's going to last for all eternity, the chances of bailing on it are severely reduced. Because it's tied up in a much larger liturgical lifestyle, because if you completely follow the Christian doctrine and the Orthodox doctrine, you literally are now a one flesh. So there isn't even the possibility of going backwards. So in that respect,
that doesn't seem true to me at all. Inherently so, at least, because there are plenty of married people who are unhappy.
Well, happiness has nothing to do with it. Happiness is not a word.
You can be unified but have a terrible marriage. And if that's the case, you can be unified but have a terrible marriage, it seems like having a terrible marriage would be terrible for your kids.
Well, okay, but it's all these things have to work together. So in a Christian marriage, it's like you're not thinking of your own happiness; you're thinking of the unified happiness. You would practice poverty, so you don't care about your financial. I mean, you're not negligent of it, but ultimately you're rich because you're right with God. You don't need anything else. All you need is the love that God gives you. You don't need any external justification. You don't need anybody telling you you're doing anything right. You don't need society to give you money. In fact, if society wants to kill you, that's fine too. Let them nail you to a cross. So if you in that respect, there's no reason to ever despair. There's no ever reason to lose faith. God got your back. So it's like technically, if you act it out fully, it's impossible based on the system you're going into to have anything but joy.
Okay.
Well, you always know that you're loved and you're unified with your other half, and you're set. Everything else is just a detail.
Okay.
You know, like
Well,
that's
it sounds
for,
like you're agreeing with what I said about how what's important in a marriage is that two people love each other. And then if all you need is love, then why do you need marriage?
um
Can't you just feel God's love by yourself without ever being married? Married?
uh because so the answer to this question is because there are ontological changes occurring, they actually things actually have to happen. So it's not like being not baptized and being baptized is completely different things. So being
Why?
actually joined in marriage, because real changes are occurring.
How is
It's
there
not just
like how do you know that any changes are actually occurring other than water being splashed on someone's head and people
well
having a
that's
strong
well
belief that it's doing something?
that comes back to the whole thing about that's why I'm studying epistemology and ontology right now to lay out these claims more fully, which is a fancy way of saying that it depends on what, like again with this idea of the ends reveal the beginnings. It's like if you believe in certain faith claims at the beginning, or you believe in certain presuppositions, then you build a boat, and the boat will one day carry grain. If you believe there are real changes occurring, then maybe that's a prerequisite for the real changes to occur, and then maybe experientially in your own life you can see that and experience that. But you'll never know if those are there unless you try it. You know what I mean? So like I can prove to you what something tastes like all day long. Until you eat it, you never know what it tastes like. And that's the same with most Christian claims. Unless you actually have the faith and do the thing, it's all just an intellectual exercise, like we were talking about earlier. You don't really know what's there. So it's like
It doesn't seem to me like any of what you're saying justifies the claim that the claim that you've used at some point in this that this is capital G good, because it doesn't sound like to me like this is anything superior to anything inherently superior to any other worldview, because you can live by example and live by as good of an example in any other way that you choose to, any other type of Christian, any type of Christianity or any other religion or any other non-religious view, and still inspire people in the same way.
well, exactly right. So that would be something maybe you could try to measure. That's the experiment we all run with our own lives. That's where the free will comes in. So it's not for me. It's not for me or for anyone. That's why you're not supposed to judge other people. It's like you don't know. It's up for you to decide for yourself. What that's the best answer you could give. You know, like
Okay.
you can't. Yeah, it's not something to be told to people. It's an invitation. You know, and one thing that I really like about the way they talk about God is God makes offers, but everything has to be accepted. At no point did Jesus come down and knock down the door and say, "You must, you must, you must, you must." Very un-Islam. You know, it's like these are offerings, these are gifts, the gift of new creation, the gift of the good news. If you want to partake in it, you can see where it'll lead you, and if you don't, then you don't. But it's up to you. And
Okay, I
yeah,
respect
and that's
that. You're not trying to force your worldview on anyone.
and see, and this is actually, I think, a really important point, because if you think that's a good point of view, which I think really has to be, this explains a lot of the quote unquote things that don't make sense in the Bible, or or Old Testament stuff. Because if you imagine enacting a plan that doesn't involve compulsion and doesn't involve basically turning people into puppets, it's like if people have to voluntarily understand and choose things, that's like well, that's the problem you run in with employees, or with partners in every human interaction, right? If you don't have a magic switch to flip, which is like the compulsion switch, it's very messy and very gradual to build up those things. And that's the exact story you see in the Bible, and that's the exact experience we have building relationships with people in real life. And that's what God's trying to do in the Eastern Christian conception. He's trying to build a relationship with you. That's something that takes a lot of work on both. Well, I don't want to say a lot of work on both sides, but that's something that's a long term project. You
Okay,
know,
but
and that's why God.
it seems to me like compulsion and making people into puppets can easily be what happens with orthodoxy or any form of Christianity or any other form of religion, uh, in the same way that it can with any other worldview, which is the point I keep going back to.
Yes, yeah, and see, and that's why my priest's main message is don't turn Christianity into a religion. It's like, and I can't remember what you were saying earlier that was talking about that. Oh yeah, when you were talking about your belief in beauty, it's like that. It's supposed to come, in my understanding, it's supposed to come from a spiritual, voluntary, in like from yourself, from your own being. That's where it's supposed to come from, not from following a set of rules. Like the moment because that's an abdication of responsibility. So like what the priest always warns is like, if you turn what I'm saying into a set of rules to follow, then you've destroyed it. It's done. Christianity is no longer special. It's just a religion. It's everything they say it is. That's bad. But if you actually live out Christ by choice, from your own spiritual self, from your own heart, that's what we're talking about here. That's what we're trying to do. And I think that's just the proper emphasis is on your own heart, your own nous is what the word they use. That communion with God, that's guiding you. And there's this really beautiful idea that all the dogmas and doctrines are just signposts and like pointers to help you do that in your own heart, in your own spirituality. And that's where the real action is. It's one thing that Protestants sometimes get right, I think. So.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I respect that. Yeah, as long as one of my main points throughout this has just been that there are I'm a pluralist basically. Like I think whatever worldview and ideology works for people is the one that they should practice, and it seems like we agree about that. Actually, you just prefer the Orthodox Christian view.
I think it's much more effective at creating the kind of unity and the kind of community and the manifestation of love. I think it makes it much more concrete and real and healthy. I think I see that very clearly.
I don't think it does, but we can agree to disagree on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, how many Orthodox Christians do you know out there in Alberta?
None. You're the only Orthodox Christian I know.
Yeah, no, I'm just focused on.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much, Andrew. For I really wanted to. I don't have many people. Like, funnily enough, like I don't have many people to deep dive on these topics on. So it's really, I find it very, very valuable to have an opportunity to kind of articulate some of this and be challenged on it and see the weaknesses of my own understandings and see what parts of it I haven't thought through or what parts of it haven't been thought through by anyone, perhaps. Right. So I find it very valuable. So thank you very much for lending me your attention and brain power for a while. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, well, I'm glad that we had this. That you were okay with me grilling you on a lot of these things and stating my opinions just as blatantly as you do, because you know that I don't necessarily agree with these, but worldviews, but I'm interested in them, and it seems like we agree in sort of this idea of pluralism, even though you seem to value your own worldview more than I do, which makes total sense. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Otherwise I'd change my worldview, right?
Yeah.
Or it'd be crazy. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah. I was just gonna say actually, this would be a good time to stop now. So it's good. It sounds like you're ready to finish up there too. So
yeah, I am. I'm right in front of my house, so it's time to go back in.
All right. Well,
okay, awesome.
Yeah, thanks everyone for watching this episode of the Mindgasms podcast. I hope you liked this deconstruction, explanation, and semi-debate about these Orthodox positions on subjects like free will, religion, and God. And yeah, thanks to those of you who click the like button on this video, subscribe to my channel, share this everywhere, comment on it, whether especially if you have regardless of what your opinions are on religion or different religions or atheism or anything. And especially thanks to those of you who give me money on Patreon, and I'll put the link in the description for this like I always do. And yeah, check out the other chats that I've done with Shane on here. We did one on Justin Trudeau winning the Canadian federal election, and he's on those postmodern theology series that we've been doing with Chief Keefe, aka Tim Keefe, and Max Horn. And like I always say, I love you all, keeping the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. And also, think about different perspectives on subjects like free will, the place of religion in society, and the definition of God. And yeah, so what do you want to say before we finish up here, Shane? Anything
love
else?
my neighbor as thyself. Jesus
Okay.
saves.
All right.
Okay.
Jesus saves,
Right.
praise Odin, praise Vishnu, praise the Buddha, praise all the
Right.
guys.
He's an okay dude. He's not the
Yeah,
worst.
yeah, no.
Yeah.
All
Not
right.
the worst.
Yeah, for sure. No, he's a good model of something to follow. I agree with that.
He's a good first step.
Yeah.
Not the worst first step.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.
Adios.